There is a thought that is rarely spoken out loud. It does not appear in formal conversations. It is not usually discussed in public. Yet it exists silently in the minds of millions of people. And according to observations often attributed to thinkers in the fields of success and wealth, this thought has the power to limit a person's prosperity without them even realizing it. It does not destroy opportunities immediately. It does not create dramatic failures. It operates in a much more subtle way. It changes how a person sees the world. It changes the decisions they make. It changes the opportunities they consider possible. And over time, it begins to shape the entire direction of their life. This silent thought begins with a simple idea, an idea that seems harmless, an idea that many people even consider realistic, the idea that prosperity belongs to other people, not to you. Perhaps you have never said this explicitly, but this thought often appears in phrases like, "People like me don't go that far. That's for people who were born into a different reality. People who have money were just lucky. Those who prosper have connections. Those who grow had some kind of advantage." These phrases may seem like simple observations about the world, but in practice, they do something much deeper. They program the mind. When someone believes that prosperity belongs to a distant group of people, something happens inside their perception. The brain begins to treat opportunities as something that does not belong to their territory. And this creates an invisible effect. The person stops looking at certain possibilities. They stop considering certain paths. They avoid certain risks. And without realizing it, they begin making smaller decisions, safer decisions, more limited decisions. This type of thinking creates a psychological boundary, an invisible line that separates what a person believes is possible from what they consider out of reach. What is interesting is that this boundary rarely has anything to do with real capability. It is born from past experiences, from phrases heard over many years, from environments where prosperity was seen as something distant. For a long time, many people grew up hearing ideas like, "Money is hard. If you're born poor, you die poor. Business is risky. Entrepreneurship is for a few people." When these ideas are repeated constantly, they begin to feel like facts. And when something feels like a fact, the mind stops questioning it. But throughout history, there are countless examples that challenge this narrative. People who started with almost nothing, without resources, without connections, without apparent advantages, and yet they managed to build something extraordinary. This did not happen because they had guarantees. It happened because they refused to accept those mental boundaries as final. There is something important about the human mind that few people notice. The mind tends to search for evidence that supports what it already believes. If someone believes prosperity is impossible for them, the brain begins selecting information that confirms that belief. It notices people who failed. It notices difficulties. It notices crises. It notices negative stories. But it ignores examples that prove the opposite. This phenomenon is known in psychology as confirmation bias, and it operates in an extremely silent way. The person begins to believe they are simply being realistic, when in reality they are only reinforcing a narrative that already existed in their mind. And the more this narrative repeats itself, the more solid it becomes. Over time, it stops feeling like an opinion. It starts to feel like an absolute truth. And when something feels absolutely true, a person's behavior adapts to that belief. They stop trying certain things. They stop exploring certain paths. They stop considering certain ideas, not because they couldn't, but because they believe they shouldn't. This is the silent thought that destroys prosperity. It is not a dramatic decision. It is not a conscious choice to fail. It is simply a limiting belief repeated so many times that it becomes part of a person's identity. The person begins to see themselves as someone who doesn't belong to that kind of world. But there is something important that needs to be understood here. Prosperity rarely begins with money. It begins with perception. The perception that new possibilities exist. The perception that different paths can be explored. The perception that many limits are simply stories repeated for too long. When that perception changes, something else begins to change as well. Decisions. And different decisions produce different results. But there is another silent thought that often accompanies the first, and it appears disguised as prudence. It is the phrase many people repeat mentally when an opportunity appears. This is not for me. That phrase may seem small, but it has an enormous impact. Because the moment someone decides something is not for them, the mind stops investigating, stops learning, stops exploring. The opportunity disappears before it is even understood. And this type of decision usually happens in seconds. A new business appears. An idea emerges. A project is presented. But the mind responds quickly. This is not for me. And the matter ends there. What is interesting is that many people who are extremely successful today heard that same phrase during their lives. But they did something different. Instead of saying, "This is not for me," they asked a different question. How could this become something for me? That small shift in question completely changes the behavior of the mind. Instead of closing doors, it begins looking for paths. Instead of rejecting possibilities, it begins investigating them. And investigation leads to learning. Learning leads to skill. And skill creates new opportunities. But there is an even deeper detail in this process. Most people believe prosperity is an event. Something that happens suddenly. A big business. A big idea. A huge opportunity. But in reality, prosperity is usually born from something much simpler. It is born from mental patterns. Small patterns of thinking repeated over years. People who prosper tend to ask different questions, make slightly different decisions, interpret problems in different ways. While some see obstacles, others see challenges. While some see risks, others see possibilities. While some move away from difficulty, others move toward it to understand what can be learned. This difference in approach may seem small at the beginning, but over 10 or 20 years, it creates completely different life trajectories. And everything begins in a very specific place. Thought. Before any external decision happens, there is always an internal decision first. The way someone interprets a situation. The way someone interprets an opportunity. The way someone interprets themselves. And it is exactly at this point that the silent thought begins to act. It whispers doubts. It whispers limitations. It whispers old stories that feel like facts. But perhaps the most important question is not whether these thoughts exist, because all of us experience limiting thoughts at some point. The most important question is another one. Do you believe them automatically, or do you begin to question them? Because the moment someone begins to question their own beliefs, something very powerful happens. The mind opens to new possibilities. And when new possibilities appear, new paths begin to emerge. But the most interesting thing about this thought is not the fear itself. Fear is part of the human experience. Everyone feels fear when facing something new. The real problem arises when fear begins to define decisions, when it stops being just a warning signal and becomes a permanent limit. Because there is something curious about the fear of failure. It rarely appears when someone is completely still. It appears exactly at the moment when a person is about to grow. It is almost as if the mind is trying to protect the person from the unknown. And at a certain level, this makes sense. The human brain evolved to avoid risks, to preserve safety, to maintain stability. For thousands of years, this mechanism helped human beings survive. But in the modern world, this same mechanism can end up limiting progress, because many of the most important opportunities in life involve uncertainty. Starting a business involves uncertainty. Changing careers involves uncertainty. Beginning a project involves uncertainty. Investing in something new involves uncertainty. And when the mind interprets any uncertainty as absolute danger, it begins to block possibilities. This is the moment when the silent thought begins to act more strongly. It does not simply say, "Don't do it." It presents scenarios. Scenarios of failure. Scenarios of judgment. Scenarios of loss. What if it doesn't work? What if people criticize me? What if I lose money? What if I try and discover that I'm not capable? These questions seem prudent. But there is something important that is rarely considered. They represent only one side of the equation. Because whenever someone asks, "What if I fail?" there is another equally valid question that is almost never asked. What if it works? This second question has the power to completely change how the mind interprets a situation. Suddenly, what seemed like only a risk also becomes a possibility. And when possibilities enter the equation, behavior begins to change. The person starts investigating, starts learning, starts exploring. And exploration is the first step toward any discovery. There is something important that many people who achieve prosperity understand over time. Failure is rarely the opposite of success. Most of the time, it is part of the process. Almost every person who has built something meaningful has faced mistakes along the way. Businesses that did not work, ideas that failed, projects that needed adjustments. But these experiences served an extremely valuable purpose. They taught. Each mistake revealed something new. Each attempt brought more clarity. Each difficulty developed skills that did not exist before. Over time, these experiences began to accumulate. And this accumulation created something powerful. Experience. Experience reduces uncertainty. Experience increases perception. Experience improves decisions. But there is an important detail. Experience cannot be acquired only through thinking. It only emerges through action. And here lies an interesting paradox. Many people avoid acting because they want to avoid mistakes. But by avoiding mistakes, they also avoid experience. And without experience, they continue to feel insecure. So they avoid acting again. This is how an invisible cycle is born. Fear leads to inaction. Inaction maintains uncertainty. Uncertainty feeds fear. And the cycle continues. Meanwhile, people who break this cycle do something different. They do not eliminate fear. They learn to act despite it. They understand that clarity emerges during the process, that skills develop through practice, that confidence grows through experience. This kind of mindset creates a different relationship with failure. Failure stops being a final verdict. It becomes information, feedback from the real world, something that can be analyzed, understood, adjusted. And when someone begins to see failure in this way, something interesting happens. Fear loses part of its power. Because the worst-case scenario no longer feels like the end of the story. It becomes just another part of the journey. There is a phrase often quoted in the world of entrepreneurship that reflects this idea well. It says that successful people do not have fewer failures. They simply have more attempts. And the more attempts someone makes, the more opportunities appear. Because each attempt opens new doors, new connections, new ideas, new possibilities. But there is another silent thought that often appears after the fear of failure. A thought that sometimes seems even more convincing. It does not say that you will fail. It says something different. It says that maybe it is already too late. So many people have already done this. The market is already full. Others started before. Maybe I missed the moment. This kind of thought can be extremely limiting because it creates the feeling that all opportunities have already been taken. But when we observe history carefully, we notice something curious. Almost every great opportunity appears saturated before someone innovates. Before the internet became massive, many people said technology was an impossible market to enter. Before social media dominated the world, many believed online communication was already saturated. Before new businesses revolutionized entire industries, there were always experts saying there was no more space. And yet, new ideas kept emerging. New businesses kept being created. New solutions kept transforming markets. This happens because prosperity rarely comes from entering an empty market. It comes from doing something differently, solving a problem in a better way, seeing something that others ignored, improving something that already exists. And to do that, something very specific is required. Curiosity, the willingness to investigate, the willingness to ask questions, the willingness to explore. But when the silent thought says, it's already too late, curiosity disappears. The person stops investigating, stops exploring, and the path ends before it even begins. For this reason, perhaps one of the most important skills for someone who wants to prosper is not only technical knowledge, but something much simpler. The ability to question one's own thoughts. To ask, is this limit real? Or is it just an idea I have never challenged? Because many times the greatest obstacle is not in the market, not in the economy, not in the circumstances. It is inside an internal narrative that has never been carefully examined. And the moment someone begins to examine these narratives, something starts to change. New questions appear. New perspectives emerge. New decisions become possible. And little by little, what once seemed impossible begins to look merely difficult. And what once seemed difficult begins to look like a matter of time and learning. But there is still one final silent thought that, according to many scholars of human behavior, can be even more dangerous than the fear of failure or the feeling that it is already too late. A thought that installs itself very quietly, and that many people carry for years without realizing it. It appears in a very simple sentence. A sentence that seems small, but that has an enormous impact on the way someone builds their life. The sentence is this: I'm not that kind of person.
Diz frase sem simple. Almost innocent. But when someone begins to repeat it frequently, it can become one of the most powerful barriers against prosperity. Because the moment a person says, I'm not that kind of person, they are defining the limits of their own identity. And identity has a profound impact on behavior. The way someone sees themselves largely determines the choices they consider possible. For example, if someone believes they are not the type of person who understands business, they will hardly explore opportunities in that field. If someone believes they are not the type of person who leads, they will probably avoid positions of responsibility. If someone believes they are not the type of person who prospers financially, they will begin making decisions consistent with that belief, even without realizing it. This type of thinking does not appear overnight. It usually forms slowly, through past experiences, through comments heard during childhood, through constant comparisons with other people. Perhaps someone spent years hearing that certain things were not for people like them. Perhaps they were discouraged at an important moment. Perhaps they tried something in the past and did not achieve the expected result. Over time, these experiences begin to form a narrative, an internal story about who the person believes they are. And the problem is that once this narrative is established, it begins to influence decisions silently. The person starts rejecting certain opportunities before even evaluating them. They begin avoiding certain challenges before even trying. They start choosing smaller paths because they believe those are the only ones available. But there is something extremely important about identity that many people do not realize. It is not fixed. It is built. And more importantly, it can be rebuilt. Throughout history there are countless examples of people who completely changed the way they saw themselves. People who started believing they had no talent, no resources, no advantages at all. And yet they developed skills, created opportunities, and built prosperity. This happened because, at some point, they stopped accepting that old narrative as final. They began testing new possibilities. Even if it felt uncomfortable at first. Even if it felt strange at the beginning. There is an important concept in psychology that helps explain this process. It suggests that people tend to act according to what they believe they are. If someone believes they are a disciplined person, they tend to act with discipline. If someone believes they are creative, they tend to explore ideas. In the same way, if someone believes they are limited, they tend to behave in limited ways. For this reason, changing the internal narrative can have an enormous impact on how someone acts. But this does not happen simply by repeating positive phrases. Real change happens when small actions begin to challenge the old identity. When someone who believes they are not capable decides to try something new. When someone who believes they are not creative begins exploring ideas. When someone who believes they are not an entrepreneur decides to test a small project. Each of these actions creates a small piece of evidence. Evidence that the old narrative might not be completely true. Over time, these pieces of evidence begin to accumulate. And when enough evidence appears, identity begins to change. The person starts seeing themselves differently. And when identity changes, behavior changes with it. This explains why many people who achieve prosperity say the greatest transformation happened fast inside them. Before any external change. Before any financial results. Before any recognition. The change began in the way they started seeing themselves. In the way they began interpreting opportunities. In the way they began responding to challenges. They stopped asking, is this for me? And started asking, how can I learn to do this? This small change in language completely alters how the brain processes challenges. Instead of closing doors, it begins searching for paths. Instead of avoiding difficulties, it begins exploring solutions. And when the mind enters this mode of exploration, something interesting happens. The world begins to feel larger. More possibilities appear. More ideas emerge. More opportunities become visible. But perhaps the most important part of this entire reflection is understanding that the silent thoughts do not disappear completely. They continue appearing from time to time. The fear of failure may return. Doubt may arise again. The feeling that something might not be for you can reappear. This is part of the human experience. The difference is that when someone learns to recognize these thoughts, they lose much of their power. Because they stop being absolute truths. They become just thoughts. Temporary ideas. Suggestions from the mind that can be questioned. And the moment someone learns to question these thoughts, something changes deeply. The person stops being controlled by them. And begins making decisions with greater awareness. With more curiosity. With more courage. Prosperity, in this sense, is rarely just a matter of strategy. It is also a matter of mindset. Of perception. Of identity. And perhaps the most important question someone can ask themselves is not about money, business, or opportunities. Perhaps the most important question is much simpler. What silent thoughts are shaping the decisions of my life right now? Because when those thoughts begin to be examined honestly, some of them stop making sense. And when they stop making sense, new choices become possible. And new choices, repeated over time, can completely transform the trajectory of a life.